All right, now the Homer's Odyssey is sometimes described as a sequel to the Iliad, and in large part, I think that's true. Although it's a very narrowly focused sequel, it certainly does not give us the full range of the stories that happened after the 10 years at Troy up here in the northwest corner of what we would call Turkey. Certainly lots of these other stories about what happened to other Greeks and comrades of Odysseus are mentioned, alluded to. They sometimes intersect with the plot. But of course, it's mainly about the journey home of Odysseus. So Odysseus, if you remember, from the Iliad, he's the king of Ithaca, an island way over here off the west coast of the Greek mainland here. And he, like the other Greek kings and soldiers and various entourages, are once the Troy is destroyed, they get in their ships and they're all trying to get back to their various places. Now, there were lots of different legends that were told, not just by Homer, but by many other poets. And this was, of course, the whole Trojan saga was a favorite subject of the Greeks and of the storytellers. And there was a whole saga about what happened to the various Greek kings and soldiers who survived the war when they tried to get home. And the short answer to a very long question is what happened to them? Not a lot of good. Many of them drowned or were destroyed or blown off course. Agamemnon, if you remember, the king of the Greek expedition, makes his way back down to Mycenae or Argos, depending on who you're reading, only to find that his wife has been carrying on this affair and he's murdered in the bathtub. Ajax the Greater commits suicide. Ajax the Lesser is blasted by a thunderbolt, and so it's all of this. It's a very typical kind of Greek story, in that the quest object is obtained. That is, the Troy is destroyed, is defeated after 10 years, and so they do what they came to do. But that's the moment it all goes south. That's the moment the downturn, the catastrophe happens. And so the gods turn their backs on the Greeks. The tradition is that once the Greeks enter Troy, they start committing all of these sacrileges, all these horrible things, killing women and children, killing people who have taken refuge in temples, throwing infants off the battlements of Troy. In fact, there's even a tradition that Odysseus himself takes Astyanax, Hector and Andromache's baby boy, and throws him off the walls at Troy. No matter how kind of barbaric or violent we think of this day and age and this culture that produced these stories, no Greek would have seen that as being heroic or just. And so the Greeks do all of these horrible things, including Odysseus, depending on kind of what tradition you're looking at. And so the gods turn their backs. And that explains in some part why the Greeks have so much trouble getting back home. And of course, Odysseus has the most famous of these stories. So he's trying to kind of make his way down around the bend here and back to Ithaca, which, with smooth sailing would be a fairly simple journey of maybe a couple of weeks. But instead, it takes him another 10 years to get back home. And the most famous part of the story is Homer tells us that Odysseus' men make it down to around this cape. This is the last kind of geographical known point that Homer mentions by name. But once they're around this bend, that's where they kind of go off into this never land, and that's where they meet all of the famous creatures like the sirens and the Cyclops and the lotus eaters, which you'll be reading about and talking about. And he only comes back home after another 10 years of being lost, back to Ithaca, and he comes back alone, having lost all of his ships and all of his men. Have drowned, been killed, eaten, dismembered, destroyed along the way. Now, if you remember when I came to your class and I talked about the beginnings of the intro to the Iliad, I put up the intro lines to the Iliad, and I called your attention particularly to the very first word of the Iliad, which in Greek is menon, rage. And I suggested to you that you can use that word more or less as kind of a guiding signpost, benchmark, thematic word for the entire epic. And it's the rage of Achilles, is that what those 24 books of that story are really about. Now, I think to a degree it also works with the Odyssey, maybe not as a direct kind of way, but the very first word in the Odyssey here, this Greek word would transliterate, or it would sound in English as andra. It's A-N-D-R-A here. And andra is the Greek word for a man. a human being. And the first line translates, again, just like in the Iliad, it's Homer calling upon the muse. You can see Musa here. He's calling upon, says, "Speak to me, muse. Speak into me, muse, about the man Polytropon, the man of many turns, who suffered many, many things and such." And so Homer, if we follow this rule, he's calling our attention to the man, the human being. And some have taken this to mean that the Odyssey, much more so than the Iliad, is about kind of the isolation of humanity and from other human beings, from the gods. You'll remember that in the Iliad, the gods are very present. There's lots of scenes up on Olympus. There's gods coming down onto the battlefield and disguising and helping and moving around their favorites and the like. And by and large, that doesn't really happen in the Odyssey all that much. Now, the famous exception to that, of course, is Athena. The goddess Athena becomes kind of the guide, the mentor. You'll see she literally comes down and disguises herself as a figure named Mentor on Ithaca to help out Telemachus, Odysseus' son, early on. So, I mean, the gods are involved. Athena is very much involved. But they also recede. They also take a back seat. In fact, on the very second page of the Odyssey, second or third page, depending on your translation, there's a scene up on Olympus where Zeus basically says, "I've had it with human beings. They don't listen to us. We try to help them, and they don't listen. So forget them." And it's for the most part, so the gods kind of recede, and it's kind of left to Athena to pick up the pieces. So could Andra mean? Think of one thing you could think about. What does that mean? What does it mean that this focus on the human being, the isolated human being, the relationships of human beings? What again is Homer trying to say about humanity in this poem? The place of humanity in the world, in relationship to the gods, in relation to each other. What makes a human life worth living? I think that's something that the Odyssey, that Homer here is very interested in. So now I just have a few things that I think would be worth looking at and thinking about as you read the Odyssey. So first of all, I've already alluded to this. What is the role of the gods? How does it compare to the Iliad? How have the gods kind of taken their hands off the wheel to some degree? And how does that change the story? How does that change kind of notions of meaning and purpose? If the gods remove themselves from the story, where do you find meaning? Where do you find purpose if the divine aren't interested anymore? And so on the heels of that is, what makes an action moral in the Odyssey? How do you judge what's right and wrong? What's heroic? What's not heroic? Is it self-evident? Is our idea of what's moral similar to what the ancient Greeks would have found as moral? And how do you come to that kind of conclusion? I'll give you kind of a heads up as one of the things that many scholars and commentators point to is this role of, you pronounce this as xenia. And xenia, it's a Greek word. It's usually translated as kind of like guest friendship or hospitality. And it's how guests treat hosts and how hosts behave under the care of how guests behave under the care of hosts, and this kind of this reciprocal relationship of how the stranger is treated and taken in. And so there is this kind of this divinely appointed role of hospitality in the ancient Greek world, and it's still it's live in many parts of Greece even to this day. This idea that if a stranger shows up on your doorstep and is in need of food or rest or water or whatever, you don't ask that person his or her name. You take them in, you give them what they need, you give them a gift if you can, and you send them on their way after a couple of days with food and provisions. And it's only at the end of that you might bring up, you might ask, what is your name, stranger? Tell us your story. All that other stuff comes first. So that concept shows up a lot in the Odyssey. The way that the suitors are in the house of Odysseus, the way that Odysseus's men are treated in various places as they wander the seas. When Odysseus winds up amongst the people, the Phaeacians, the notion of xenia is very much at play. So could this be a way of kind of judging who's good and who's bad? Xenia as kind of a moral signpost. The kind of hero that Odysseus is, you see a little bit of this in the Iliad, but not a lot. But he's what we would call a metis hero. Metis, another Greek word, which is usually translated as kind of cunning, crafty, trickiness. That's where Odysseus's great ability lies. I mean, he's good with a bow, he's good with a spear, he's good on the battlefield, but he's best when he's using his mind. And so he's a different kind of hero than Achilles is. Achilles is the greatest warrior on the battlefield, but he's not. You wouldn't call him a genius. You wouldn't call him smart. You wouldn't call him. I mean, his instincts are amazing, but he's not crafty. He's not a planner. Odysseus is that guy, and so he uses his brain to get himself in and out of situations all along the way, and so generally speaking, kind of the cartoon understanding of the Odyssey is that we kind of revel in his craftiness, and we celebrate the trickster hero doing his tricks, and he's heroic because of his tricks that he can pull off. But is that always the case? Are we supposed to celebrate everything Odysseus does? So, arguably the most famous episode, and I'm guessing that even if you haven't read the Odyssey, you might have heard about this story within the Odyssey, is the Cyclops episode, where Odysseus and his men get trapped inside this cave, and Odysseus has to use his wits to save himself and as many of his men as possible before they're eaten by the Cyclops. Now, generally speaking, I would say that the general way that story has been taken has been as a trick to be celebrated. We kind of revel in the way that Odysseus fools the stupid Cyclops and kind of runs rings around him in terms of his intellect. But I want to kind of offer to you is that necessarily the whole story? Could we see the Cyclops as much more sympathetic, much more understandable, rather than just be a story of kind of good guy defeats bad guy, hero defeats monster? I would suggest that Homer's a lot more interesting than that, and I think he wants us to see both kind of the good side of the Metis hero, the side to celebrate and to revel in, but he also wants to say that kind of hero comes with a very, very heavy cost. So watch for that. And so in this, you see, what is Odysseus' relationship with his men? So like I mentioned, when he does ultimately get back home, all his men are dead. None of them are there to back up or to counter anything he might have to say about his journeys. He's the last man standing. So that one of the aspects of the Metis hero is that the trickster is a liar. He lies. You'll see that Odysseus is constantly making up identities for himself. Why does he do this? What's he getting out of it? Does he just do it for the sake of doing it sometimes? He's a maddening character sometimes. And so Odysseus, too, with his men, what kind of king is this? There are many places in the Odyssey where I think you could argue that he just kind of uses his men as cannon fodder. They're there to be killed. They're there to kind of satisfy Odysseus' own curiosity. All of his men die. Ask yourself, how many of his men's deaths could you lay at the feet of Odysseus himself? It's a worthy question of asking, and I don't think it's a question that's asked all that often by readers of the Odyssey. Also, his relationship with Athena. So Athena, she breaks into the narrative at several places to guide Odysseus, to disguise him, to make him more attractive than he really is, and the like. But there's also kind of this element of distrust. One of the aspects of the Metis hero is that you never fully trust anybody else, and so even Athena, who is kind of the goddess of that kind of craftiness, I think one of the reasons, maybe the main reason she loves Odysseus is because she sees a lot of herself in him. But that also you have these two Metis characters kind of in tension with each other. So is even his relationship with Athena strained because of this? And then at the end. The suitors, of course, the big central problem, which the Odyssey begins with and ends with, is you have all these suitors, all these young men on Ithaca, who are saying, "Look, listen, Odysseus has been gone so long. Of course he's dead. He's not coming home. Ithaca needs a king. So Penelope, that's Odysseus' wife, you got to just accept that Odysseus is dead and marry one of us. Life must go on, and this is long overdue." And of course, Homer doesn't hide this from this, so if you didn't know this, I'm sorry for ruining the story, but Odysseus and his small band of allies at the end get together and they kill all of these suitors to a man. There's over 50 of them that are named. And I think generally speaking, the usual way that this is taken is that, yes, the suitors are the bad guys and they get what's coming to them. How dare they try to overtake Odysseus' house? And how dare they do what they do at Odysseus' house? And I will say there's good reason for reading the story in that way, but here, like with the Cyclops episode, I think it's worth asking yourself, is it entirely just? When you look at how Odysseus handles the situation, the way that he dispatches with the suitors, all of them. Is this just? Is this right? Does he handle this in the best way? We meet a lot of these suitors. We get to know them personally in many ways. Are they all kind of the same? Or are some more sympathetic than others? I mean, they all get the blade of the sword. They all get the shaft of the arrow at the end. But do they all deserve it? Could there be a more nuanced way to look at this? And that Homer wants to see, yes, we see the justice in a king coming back and taking what is justly his, but we also see the tremendous bloody and awful cost to this at the same time. So those are just a few things that I invite you to think about, to talk about, to keep in mind as you read the Odyssey, and maybe I'll get a chance to present to you guys again. All right, see ya.